So today I'm very pleased to welcome Rick Bosch to talk about the Holland mission. Rick grew up in Holland. He went to Hope College and then got his PhD in chemistry at Northwestern University. He worked for Monsanto for about 30 years, traveling all over the world. And then when he retired, he came back to Holland. His ancestors actually came here already after the Civil War in the Holland area. He has a very deep interest in the history of Holland, and I think he owns every book written about Holland. I've borrowed a few of those and tried to add them to my library, but he keeps insisting on getting them back. So, his activities related to his interest in Holland include working at the Holland Museum, where he's a volunteer, and also working in the archives, and has been able to work through some of the original documents relating to Holland's history. Rick is also active with Ottawa County Parks and leads some hiking groups for HASP at the park, and is involved with Project Clarity, which has been improving the water quality for Lake Makatawa. So please welcome Rick Bosch.
Am I on? All right. Well, thank you so very, very much for coming. And thank you, Fran, for the nice introduction. This is about the Old Wing Mission. How many of you are familiar sort of kind of with the Old Wing Mission? Okay, a few that don't. Okay, that's good to know. How many of you have been following what's been going on with the Old Wing Mission with the stories that have been in the Sentinel? So that's great. You know, the Sentinel's just done an absolutely wonderful job of presenting what's been going on. And I really appreciate all of their efforts in, helping to save the Old Wing Mission, which is one of the things that I've been involved with, along with a whole bunch of other people. So this talk came about, and it actually goes back 60 years. My dad loved to go for rides when we were kids, and he would take us on this ride way out in the country. We would go by this White House, and he would tell us it was a mission to the Indians many, many years ago. And the house had been there a long, long time. It had something to do with the Dutch, but he really didn't quite know the entire story. So after I started volunteering in the museum, both as a docent and in the archives, the story of, what was in Holland before the Dutch arrived, and the Old Wing Mission was a very, very important part of that story. So when the opportunity came up last summer to give a talk on the Old Wing Mission at the Holland Museum, I jumped right on and said, sure, I'll do it, knowing that there were some absolutely wonderful artifacts in the archives that I'd be able to use for some of the illustrations. And just talking about, what it was all about, which is something that was near and dear to my heart. Little did I know that a few months later, all heck would break loose when LG bought it. And suddenly there were rumors all over that they were going to tear it down. And I'm just really glad that there's not my last picture of this talk is not a pile of rubble, kind of like what happened to Van Ralte's house. That yes, it's saved. It's something that, LG understands what they have now. So it's something that now it's just a matter of figuring out what's the best thing to do with it. And LG is definitely on board with trying to help us figure this out. So I could leave the story there and, we could end the talk here, but let's go back a little bit and I'll tell you some more about what's going on. But just so you know, it does have a happy ending. So. Okie dokie. How about if we try the other one? They're giving me too many options. Just for those of you who may not be aware of where the Old Wing Mission is, and this is kind of cool, we found a laser printer that you can use on the computer. It's right here on 40th Street. And Waverly Avenue is here, Country Club is here, and the LG factory is down in this area here. So I used to live here, so that really long drive into the country was 2 miles as the crow flies and 3 miles by roads. But I'm sure some of them were gravel and things like that. But, it was just something that I've always been interested in history. And when I had the opportunity to, come back here and retire and get involved in the museum, it was something that I just absolutely loved. The other thing is, Francis, I read lots and lots of books. So I had already read Bob Zwieringa's and Bill Van Apeldoorn's book on the Old Wing Mission. Those of you who know Bob knows that he writes books that are rather long. This one is over 600 pages, but it's absolutely wonderful. I think it was published in 2008. And in addition to a history of the Old Wing Mission, he also included transcripts from the diaries of both Reverend George Smith and also his wife, Arvilla. So all of that information is available. All of the annual mission reports are available. Genealogies of the Smith and Waukazoo family are available in here. And also it's dedicated to Charles Lawrence, who's a historian who lived in Saugatuck, who was very instrumental earlier about saving the mission. He actually owned it for a while and ran it as a bed and breakfast. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But especially having these transcriptions, this is from George Smith's diary, and that's pretty hard to read. We do have it on microfilm at the museum. But what he did is it's just a small little book, and there's a whole series of them from when he became a missionary till pretty much when he died. And they're actually in the Library of Congress right now. But just having the transcriptions from the time that it was important for the Old Wing Mission, it's really cool. The other thing that did unfortunately happen is that the only one that's missing is the one from 1847, right when the Dutch arrived. Would have been wonderful to have had that one, but I'm sure he lent it to somebody who didn't return it, just like Fran. And I hope he got ice cream or something for it, but unfortunately that one is lost. And Arvilla's diaries are also wonderful to read. She was a teacher. Actually, Reverend George Smith was also. But hers are, it's just something, you're just amazed that a diary can be that smooth and that easy to read. So if you're looking for information on, what the Holland area was like, back, 175 years, 180 years ago, that's something you may want to consider reading those. Just that part of it is really cool. Hers are a little bit easier to read, but once again, it's so much nicer being able to read them in typed print. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. And as I just had to bring in a picture of my bookshelf, and that's expanded since then. I'm down another half a shelf. I'm well over 100 books on the history of Holland, Ottawa County, Kent County, Allegan County. It just keeps on expanding. But I've read pretty much all of them, so it's not like I just collect them. The other thing is, for those of you who have been to the Holland Museum, down in the basement is the archives. And this is where they keep all of the paper archives, and I volunteer there. And like I said, it's just so much fun just to go through there and find out what's all there. They get about 150 requests a year from people that are writing books, and there's examples of a lot of those books that have been written on my bookshelf for people that need information on stuff. And so it's just a fun place to volunteer. In addition to other sources, the Odawa Indians, who are an important part of this story, there's 3 books that I wanted to point out. One of which is by Andrew Blackbird, who, when we were talking about Chief Waukazoo, there's actually 3 Chief Waukazoos. One's a father and the 2 sons. And Andrew was either the nephew or the cousin of the 3 chiefs. And he is somebody who literally traveled, around the United States and just wrote this really excellent memoir, both talking about his childhood and then also talking about, his adventures, throughout the U.S. The first good historical book on the Native Americans in the area is The People of the 3 Fires, which is what the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe refer to them as. Great source of information, also something that I read and reread. And then also Bill Van Apeldoorn wrote a book on Chief Waukazoo, and this is information on the Native Americans and the Chief Waukazoo in the Holland area. We've got Waukazoo Woods, which is named after the chiefs, and that also plays into our story, so we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. More information, a guy by the name of Eric Hemingway, who is a historian with the Odawa Indians, gave a talk at the Holland Museum last January. It was really fascinating because it was from the Native American perspective. And one thing that I did notice is that he spelled Waukazoo the modern way instead of the older way, where it did not have the U in it. So I just followed that way. And he also referred to the Native Americans as the Odawa Indians. So that's what I will use in this talk. And that's why I'm doing that. You know, there's so many other things I could use: Native Americans, Ottawa, et cetera, et cetera. But since this is what he used, I decided, you know, that would be the way that I would go as far as talking about this. Those of you who subscribe to the Sentinel, I'm sure have read Steve Vanderveen's columns on the history of Holland. He wrote several on the Old Wing Mission. I just wanted to acknowledge him. And then also the Joint Archives of Holland, which is the Hope College and the Western Theological Seminary Archives, also have a lot of information. They publish articles, and one of them came out last summer about the Old Wing Mission right before I gave my last talk. So, you know, there's so much information. It's just hard to sort it off through and combine it into a talk that I'm supposed to, you know, go for about an hour, hour and a half. So let's go. Topics I will discuss. I'll talk about the Odawa history of the Native Americans in the area, talk about the three chiefs Waukazoo. I'll talk about what was going on historically in the 1830s in Michigan and what led to the Old Wing Mission. Talk about the history of the Old Wing Mission, Reverend George Smith, who was the missionary there, and the owner of the house that, you know, we now refer to as the Old Wing Mission. The arrival of the Dutch, the migration of the Native Americans and the Indians to Leelanau Peninsula, some information on the Smith Waukazoo family, talk some more about the Old Wing Mission building, and then talk about what's been going on for the last 6 months. So that's sort of the outline. Any questions on anything so far? Yes. Ask that in the questions. That was something about why do I have a bottle of Tide on my bookshelf? I'll talk about it then, okay? That's a good story. As far as the history of the Odawa Indians, they were a member of the People of the Three Fires, which is a confederation of the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe Indian tribes. They started off on the East Coast, and as the Europeans arrived, they moved further and further west. Eventually ended up in the Great Lakes area, probably around the late 1600s, early 1700s. They also had another area that they occupied close to Lake Winnipeg, where if you go to the Canadian border right by North Dakota and Minnesota, go north about 100 miles. There's a huge lake up there called Lake Winnipeg. Sometimes they call it the Sixth Great Lake. It's actually larger than Lake Ontario, but it's only about 30 or 40 feet deep. So it's more of a giant marsh than a big lake. So, but that's all right. As the People of the Three Fires were moving to the west, they managed to annoy the Iroquois Indians, and there was a war that took place in those territories between the Iroquois Indians and the Odawa for over 100 years. It finally ended in 1670. The Odawa especially were very closely tied to the French Canadians, and they were also nominally Catholic. Here's a map of the different homelands. Once they made it to Michigan, the Odawa Indians tended to be in this corner, and they were about 15% of the 10,000 Native Americans that were in Michigan around 1800. The Odawa are in here. There's one area right around Little Traverse Bay where there were a series of villages, and there was another series of villages along the Grand River. The Waukazoo bands were here. We're part of this band here. The Potawatomi, which is about 40% of that 10,000 people, were mainly in southern Michigan, and the Ojibwe were here and around Lake Superior. Potawatomi kind of came around into to Illinois a bit. And when the Native Americans arrived, there were not a lot of other Native Americans in the state of Michigan, but they were part of the Sioux tribes. So they were actually forced west when the Odawa and the Potawatomi especially moved in. Which caused a few issues later on that, if I remember, I'll manage to remember that. Otherwise, ask me in the questions if you're interested. As I mentioned, with the Waukazoo family, there's actually three chiefs that are part of our story. Joseph, they were all leaders of a band that typically consisted of about 100 to 300 Indians that mainly between 1815 and 1845 spent their summers up by, Little Traverse Bay, Charlevoix, that area. And then they would winter in Holland area. Their place where they really liked to be was now it's called Waukazoo Woods, what's also now called Superior Point. That's where their village was. And they migrated back and forth there for quite a few years until they couldn't do it anymore. Joseph Sr. lived for about 75 years, born approximately 1760, probably in northern Michigan, but he may have been born close to Lake Winnipeg. The stories vary. He ended up going to Lake Winnipeg when he grew up, and then was a chief there till about right before the War of 1812. So 1810 or so, he migrated to Holland, to Western Michigan, and then started that migration up and down. Like I said, it sounded like retirement. You go north for the summer, you winter south, and the other reason for going north in the summers, there was always a giant powwow on Mackinac Island, and he would go up for the party. And later on, there was different things that were given out, like money, because payments for some of the treaties that were signed. So that was their lifestyle for quite a few years. He also had 4 brothers that were also all Ottawa chiefs, 3 of which supported the French and actually the British in the War of 1812, and 1 supported the Americans, and Chief Waukazoo appears to have remained neutral. So he was also a Protestant. Most of the other Odawa Indians had already converted to Catholicism. He actually became a Protestant along with his 2 sons. Joseph Sr.'s wife was Choni. They had 3 kids, Charlotte Kinawa, and she was a native healer who was quite famous. So she never converted to Christianity, but was really one of the big supporters of the Old Wing mission when it was in the Holland area for 10 years. Another one of her brothers was Joseph Jr., who was chief for 10 years. And his wife was Tapita. And then Peter Waukazoo, who became chief after Joseph Jr. died. And I guess that's about it. So in 1800, Native Americans had Michigan pretty much all to their own. There were a few traders in the area, but all in all, they lived a pretty good life. And this started to change in 1821 as there was pressure for the Native Americans to sign treaties so that the Americans could get their land. The first one that affected the Odawa Indians was in 1821. And I'll show you on the next page a map of that. But there really weren't any settlers in the area, so it really didn't affect them that much. There was a couple of traders, one in the Louis Campow, who was in Grand Rapids area, and then Ricks Robinson, who was where Grand Haven is now. And he had brothers that also had different trading posts along the Grand River. But what really started to change things in 1830 when Andrew Jackson became president, and you had the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Trail of Tears with the Cherokee. Same thing happened in southern Michigan with the Potawatomi. Essentially, all of them were moved west. And if you remember, they had this war with the Sioux tribes when they kicked them out. Well, the Sioux tribes were really not happy when they were suddenly coming west into their territories. So there was just a lot of problems associated with that. Suddenly, you had more and more American settlements coming in the Grand Rapids area when the Americans realized you had these absolutely wonderful falls there and the rapids where you could use them for hydraulic power. More and more industry developed there. And suddenly in Holland, on Superior Point, suddenly there was a small American village called Superior, which was started by Captain John Banks and several friends from the Kalamazoo area. At that time, the channel was open, so they were able to sail into Lake Macatawa. They established a small shipbuilding yard. They had what else? They had a blacksmith shop. They had a lumber mill there, about a half a dozen houses or so. So it's just a little village there, but suddenly the Native Americans who had lived there for all of these years suddenly couldn't live there anymore, and they had to figure out somewhere else to live. So as I'd mentioned with the treaties, the Treaty of 1821 took over this land here, which really affected the Potawatomi and also the Odawa who lived along the Grand River. So suddenly a lot of them were forced to move. There wasn't a whole lot of settlement except for along the Grand River. But then suddenly you had Allegan, you had Superior. There was just various other places, and the Native Americans knew this was not good. They were going to lose their freedom of being able to, be hunter-gatherers and live their lifestyle. So they were looking for other ways to survive and not have to move out west. At that time, there was another treaty that came, which is called the Treaty of 1836, which is pretty much giving up the rest of the Odawa land north of there. We'll talk about that on this next slide. Joseph Waukazoo Sr. died in 1835, and then Joseph Waukazoo Jr. became chief. At that time, they were starting to negotiate the Treaty of 1836, and Joseph Jr. and some of the young Odawa chiefs had the chance to go to Washington, D.C., meet the president, and negotiate this treaty. So, of course, they said, sure, we're going. And the older chiefs said, don't sign anything. Unfortunately, they did. And the treaty that they signed was actually very, very good for them. It included money to pay off their debts. It included quite a bit of payment for the land that they were giving up. It was something that was, then those payments and supplies are going to last for 20 years. There was money that was going to be paid directly to the Native Americans for schools, missions, and agricultural assistance. And it was also something where they were going to have areas where they could live forever. Unfortunately, things kind of changed as the treaty got to Congress, and Congress said, well, we'll give you the money, especially the money to pay off traders like Rich Robinson and Louis Campow for all of the supplies you've been getting. We're not going to give you as much money as we said we were. Oh, this money for the schools and missions. Well, we Americans are going to control it because we're not sure you Native Americans have enough control to do it. And we're going to kick you off of these areas that you really wanted to have forever. And instead, you can have guaranteed use of this land for 5 years, unless you settle down. If you started farming, bought the land, and converted to Christianity, Protestant Christianity, then you would be allowed to stay. Henry Schoolcraft was in charge of the Native Americans. He was like the Indian agent in Holland at the time. And he started off being their friend. And Henry had a Native American wife, so he spoke the language fluently. And then suddenly, after the first treaty, he then helped the United States come up with this much more restrictive treaty. And unfortunately, the Native Americans were just forced to sign it because they really didn't have much of an option. And another thing that was going on in the United States at the time was the Protestant missionary movement. You may have heard of the Great Revival for the Protestants in the 1820s, sort of on the eastern coast of the United States. The same thing was happening, that they were looking for ways to establish missions to, quote unquote, civilize the Indians, teach them, convert them to Protestantism, teach them to read and write, teach them farming practices. And there were several early missions in the Holland area. The first one was actually in Grand Rapids in 1821. That didn't last. And then another one was started in 1824 that did last. And these were right around the area. The village was close to where the Ford Museum and the Grand Rapids Public Museum is. So the first mission was a little bit to the north of there. And as the Native Americans had to move south, they first moved to the Thornapple River. The missionaries just followed along, and then they had to move again further south. And once again, the mission just kept on going down south with them. The other mission that started on Mackinac Island was with Reverend William Ferry in 1824. If you go visit Mackinac Island, there's the old mission downtown. That is the mission that Reverend Ferry started. And he eventually decided that he wanted to do more than just be a missionary, so that he was one of the founders of Grand Haven, I believe in 1835. So here's a map of where some of the missions are. Up here's Mackinac Island. Here's where the old wing mission, so stay tuned on that one. in Grand Rapids, the first mission was here. The second one, Thornapple River, was here. I think it eventually moved to this one here. Later on, after the Native Americans left the Old Wing Mission, they came up here to another mission in the late 1840s, 1850, right around there. And there's quite a nice grouping of missions here, which were for the Potawatomi and the Odawa Indians, that have another interesting history, but something I just didn't have time to follow up on. So, any questions so far? Well, let's talk about Reverend George and Arvilla Smith, George is our missionary who came and ran the Old Wing Mission. Both he and Arvilla were born in Vermont. They became teachers in Vermont. They married in Vermont. And George decided he wanted to become a missionary. Both of them were from large families and they were not the oldest children. So they just really didn't have many opportunities in the Vermont area. So they wanted to move out west. And some of Arvilla's siblings were already moving into the Allegan County area. So when it was time to become a missionary, George had studied, and the person who he studied with was a Mason. And George decided he didn't like Masons, and he refused to acknowledge the fact that this was good. So the preacher that he was studying with refused to allow him to become a pastor. The excuse that his teacher used is that he wasn't good enough in Greek and couldn't qualify, but you kind of don't think there's a whole lot of use for Greek on the frontier. But it was also interesting that George really struggled to learn the native languages also. So he may have had a little bit of problems with languages. I don't know for sure, but in any case, he was not ordained in Vermont. He moved to Allegan County with his wife. They had the son already, George Jr., and one of his wife's sisters into Allegan County. And he became ordained there. He was the first Congregationalist minister ordained in Michigan. And then soon he became a pastor of several small churches in the area. He was also somebody who was skilled as a farmer. He was also skilled as a carpenter because he had done these things while he was studying, plus a teacher. So he was somebody who was really set up well to become a missionary on the frontier. And where the Old Wing Mission was, in the 1840s, that was the frontier. Okay. There we go. As far as the beginnings of the Old Wing Mission, Michigan became a state in 1837. There were not a lot of people living on the west side of Michigan, so there was always an interest in having more people there, whether they were Americans or Native Americans. So there was really the pressure that had happened before then to get the Potawatomi to move west had pretty well disappeared. But Chief Waukazoo just couldn't find a good place for the Native Americans to live. So they were wandering around. And in 1837, he met Reverend Smith and asked if he would help them start a mission for his people. Since he had helped negotiate the treaty, he knew what they had to do to stay in Michigan, which was buy land, convert to Christianity, stay put, learn to read and write. So he was able to form so Reverend Smith said, yeah, I'll become your missionary. And Judge John Kellogg, who was in Allegan, one of the early settlers there, had come from the East Coast, had money, and besides being a speculator in land, he was also somebody who was very religious and started a society called the Western Michigan Society to benefit the Indians in 1838, with money both coming from the area in southwestern Michigan, and also with money from the Presbyterian Church on the west and on the East Coast. Let me get a drink of water a second. The mission became a reality in 1839. And this was the first time that Indians were allowed to do this was they were actually able to buy back some of their land. And they used some of the money that they were getting from the treaties and went to Ionia. And after they had realized that there was this wonderful place right on the Ottawa County and the Allegan County border, they bought 1,360 acres of land. And it was wonderful farmland. And it was just really the right place to be. And they named it Ode Wing, which was one of Chief Joseph Sr.'s brothers who had just recently died. So they named it after him. So that's why it's called Ode Wing Mission. Now, as I mentioned, in the Holland Museum, we have lots and lots of really cool documents. And here's two of them. So after the land was bought by Waukazoo, he then distributed it to the various tribes members. And here's two of the documents that we have that were signed the same day that were part of that distribution, where he was giving land back to this person and that person. I'm not sure exactly who these were. I think one was a Teresa Waukazoo, who must have been one of his relatives. I'm not quite sure who, and another Native American that I'm just not quite sure who it was. But this all happened so that 1,360 acres were split up between, the various members of the tribe. And there were about 140 members of the tribe. Then I think there were 30 families, and 20 some of them ended up with land. So it was something that they all had their little section that they could do with what they wanted. Some of them did a lot with it. Some of them really didn't do much of anything. In addition to that, here's another deed that we have in the Holland Museum collection. And this is actually something where Peter Waukazoo bought some additional land. And those other ones were 1839. I believe this one is 1840. And I was so excited. I saw a signature from John Tyler on here, and Rick Jenkins, who's the registrar there, said, no, it's not the real president. Whoever was the person who was, worked in Ionia, the register of deeds or whatever, just went ahead and signed them. So I thought we had things from, President Polk and President Tyler, but no such luck. So if you were, as I mentioned earlier, here's where the Ode Wing Mission is, the house, and that is on 40th Street. This is Country Club. This is Waverly. This is Lincoln. This is 48th Street. And this is 32nd Street. And these are where the various Indians owned land. Yes. Yes. The question was, what was the land like? It was heavily wooded. One of the things that the Native Americans did was come to the Holland area during the winter so they can make maple sugar. And they made tons and tons of maple sugar, like 5, 10, 15,000 pounds every winter. And one of the advantages of Waukazoo Woods, there was lots of maple trees in there at the time that they could use. And this area also had maple trees. It also had very, very fertile land. We all laugh at Van Raalte about buying all this swampland, but some of the best farmland in Michigan is actually in this general area. Some of it just needed to be drained a little bit, but they're Dutch. They could figure out how to do that. So, but so this was really a good place for this. If you get too close to the lake, the land is too sandy. So they had to be far enough away from the lake. And also, if you were too close to the lake, there were so many issues where the traders were there. And what they would do is come in with their booze, sell it to the Indians. And then, the Indians would have, drink too much. And there were just lots and lots of issues there. Becoming civilizing the Indians, the thought was if we get them away from Lake Macatawa, then we will be able to help convert them to Christianity, keep them out here, then they'll settle in on this land. Didn't really work out quite that way, but it was a good thought. The other thing I would like to point out is that here is where the Smith house was. And this is the general area where right now all of those houses that were bought by LG are located. And there was a school there, there was a house and some other things here. And what I find interesting is that the Waukazoo family owned all of the land along here. So this is Choni, who was Chief Waukazoo Sr.'s wife, owned this land. Topeka, who was the wife of George Jr. Kinnequa, who was his sister. Mary Waukazoo was Chief Peter Waukazoo's oldest daughter. So this is the area that was the most successful. It was pretty close, to the Old Wing missions itself. And it was all of the Waukazoo family that made it successful. Some of these other areas, I think they were more just bought so that, you got some free land. And some of them were farmed, small farms, but the area in here is the area that really was developed. Other thing I want to mention is that a lot of these graphics were done by Mark Cook. Some of you may remember Mark. He worked for Hope College for many years and ran the bookstore. He also works as an illustrator for a lot of Bob's Wieringa's books. So Bob was kind enough to share all of his illustrations that he had from the book. So I was able to get better copies for this talk versus what I had for the talk that I gave at the museum, where I was just taking shots with my iPhone. They were a little crooked and everything. These are a lot better quality. So this is also interesting. These are tax receipts for Joseph Waukazoo and also Mary Waukazoo. One was from 1840, paid in 1841. Another one was 1841 paid in, or 1842 paid in 1843. So they had to pay taxes even way back then. Of course, Joseph's taxes were, I think, $1.18, and his niece's taxes were 31 cents, something like that. So we pay a little bit more now, but they probably didn't get all the services that we get. So let's start talking a little bit more about the mission itself. An interesting group of people helped run it. The first guy, once it was established that they had the land, they knew where it was going to be. The first thing that Reverend George Smith did is have a cabin built for his family. And that was in 1839. They finally moved over there. And I'll talk more about the other buildings that were there, but just kind of imagine literally a cabin out in the middle of nowhere. The guy by the name of Joseph Eliot, who was, his mother was Native American, his father was American, and he actually was a graduate of Oberlin College who heard about this mission and came for several months just to help get it established. So on some of those deeds that I showed earlier, his signature is on there, and just really helped get things going. Jim Prickett, who lived in Allegan, was also, his mom was Native American, his father was American. He was their translator. Unfortunately, he had an issue with alcohol, and for Sunday morning church services after Saturday night, he just was not very reliable to be there and show up to translate. So he got fired a couple of times. A lot of frustration for Reverend George Smith with him. Edward Cowles was a teacher who was in the Allegan area, and he helped out at the mission for a while. One of the reasons for helping out at the mission is you actually earn money. So like Jim Prickett being the translator, would earn $100 a year, which was good money on the frontier. The teachers earned $400 a year. Later on, we're going to be talking about farming instructors. They also earned $400 a year. And Reverend George Smith was supposed to get $500 a year through the missionary societies, but very rarely he got paid. He might be lucky and get some potatoes or a few things like that, but it was tough for him, especially early on. After Edward Cowles moved on, another lady, Mary Ann Willard, who was also half Native, became the teacher. And she also spoke the Native American languages fluently, so she became the translator. She also lived with the Smiths and helped out with their 3 kids. Probably should have gotten $500 a year, but since she was a woman, I hate to say it, but she only got $200, but that's the way it was back then. Dr. Osmond Goodrich was the first farming instructor, and he was also he was actually the doctor from Allegan, and figured he didn't know a whole lot about farming, but he thought he would fake it and earn $400 a year. Didn't spend a whole lot of time at the mission, caused some problems. The Native Americans were just not happy with him at all. So finally, everybody got mad enough and he left. And then Reverend Smith had his brother-in-law take over, who's Francis Mill, as a farming instructor. He had a bunch of health issues. he also just did not work out at all. But then finally, Isaac Fairbanks was appointed as the farming instructor, and Isaac did an absolutely wonderful job. So when you think about Fairbanks Avenue, he was one of the founders of the Methodist Church. Just an excellent person, just did an absolutely wonderful job. And you know, him with Reverend Smith were finally able to turn things around. And by that time, Reverend Smith was pretty fluent in the Odawa language, so he didn't need a translator anymore. Then after Isaac Fairbanks left in 1848, James McLaughlin, who was the husband of the cousin of our villa's, wife or somebody, he became the farming instructor, but by that time they'd already decided they were going to leave the area. So he just also kind of happened to be a carpenter and a ship's captain. So he went and bought a ship for them in Chicago, fixed it up, and he was the guy who helped them sail north to the Leelanau Peninsula. So more than you need to know, but you know. So let's talk about the improvements. The first building on this site was the Smith cabin, which was built in 1839. Unfortunately, Reverend Smith contracted it out, and the two people that were supposed to do it didn't do the job that they were supposed to do. So it was unfinished when they had to move in, still didn't have windows or doors. So, you know, Arvilla talks in her diaries about hearing the wolves howling at night and thinking there was just this thin blanket between her and who knows what. So she was not happy. But since Reverend Smith was a carpenter, he was able to get that fixed pretty quickly. About that same time, they built a church, which is about the same size as the cabin. About 1840, that just kind of disappears into history. I'm not quite sure what happened to that. Then they built a school. By this time, they were able to get some money from the federal government to build this absolutely wonderful school. It was, 24 by 32. I think it had 10 windows. It had desks, well built. And this really became, in so many ways, a lot of the mission. And that actually later on was sold to Fillmore Township and became their school in the area for several years after the Native Americans moved on. When Isaac Fairbanks moved in there to become the farming instructor, he built a cabin on the other, will now be the other side of 40th Street on the north side. Not quite sure where that was. It was supposedly like 50 to 100 feet from the Smith cabin, so it might be under 40th Street for all I know, but no real record of where that was. And then the house that we refer to as the Old Wing Mission, the Smith House, was started in 1844, and it took until 1846 to get it done. The Smith family took a sabbatical in 1845 and went out to Vermont for at least 6 months, and it just kind of slowed down the construction of the house. But at that time, he was the teacher, so he was getting paid by the federal government and was able to put that money into buying, real lumber and making a real house. There was also a barn in the area. I don't know if it was by the Fairbanks cabin or else by the Smith house, but it actually burned down in the 1871 Holland fire. It's amazing how far out that fire went. If you studied the fire, it always said that it went out into the country and destroyed farms, and here's something that it did destroy. I found that to be kind of fascinating. So the mission lasted until 1849. Let's talk a little bit about 1839 to 1846. A really slow start getting things going. The school had 8 to 40 students, lots of unexcused absences. You kind of have to remember what the Native American lifestyle was. They were north in the summer. They came back in the fall. Quite often they would plant crops in the spring, harvest them in the fall, whatever survived. They would then go to school for a few months, and then there was maple sugar time, and it was time for everybody to go out there and tap the trees and boil down the sap. Then they headed north again. So there really wasn't a whole lot of time for school for the Native Americans. However, the Smith children and some of the other Americans in the area were able to take advantage of the school, and they seem to have gotten a pretty good education there. Finally, in 1842, the long-promised oxen arrived. Then they were able to do more farming. Until then, it was really hit and miss. The other thing, if you remember, I'd mentioned the big party up on Mackinac Island every summer, where the Indians would go to get their money and their, whatever trade goods that they were given. That was moved off of Mackinac Island for the Odawa Indians, moved either to Grand Rapids or to Grand Haven. So it wasn't quite as big of a party, and it was a lot closer. So the Native Americans were much more willing to stay in the area. Chief Joseph Waukazoo died in 1845. I was replaced by his brother, Peter. Not quite sure what happened. He was 40 years old. It sounded like he had some sort of lung issues, whether he died of pneumonia. I'm wondering if it was tuberculosis, but it was something that caused him to die. He was a really talented chief. His father was a really talented chief. His brother, Peter, was okay, but not as good, had a lot more trouble kind of keeping things under control. The other thing that happened is that Reverend Smith had been preaching by the Old Wing Mission in the church up there. And the Native Americans are saying, a lot of us are living on the landing, which is on the next slide. And this is where Heinz Pickle is. So why don't you come over here and give your sermons here, which he started doing in 1844, but that didn't turn out so good, as you will find out. But so the Odawa Indians were nominally Catholic. Not that very many of them converted, but they were very familiar with the Catholic religion. And there was a priest by the name of Father Wiskowski, who was from Eastern Europe, sponsored by Rix Robinson and Louis Campbell, the traders who wanted the Native Americans to continue to live their lifestyle so that they would get money, spend it with their, with the traders, and then the traders would make money. So they sponsored the priest. Judge Kellogg decided to donate an acre on Black Lake to the Odawa, which is called the Landing, and that's really where Heinz Pickle is now. They were living there anyway, so he said, I'll just permanently give you some land, which was also convenient for the Smith family because they were over there and they were just able to get a lot of their trade, their goods, their potatoes or whatever was being donated to them. They were able to pick them up there versus having to go to, say, Singapore or Allegan to pick them up. And then in 1842, Chief Joseph McSabe, who was Potawatomi, arrives. He was a war chief for the Potawatomi, and all of the other members of his part of the Potawatomi tribes had been moved to out west. He and his 3 sons and their families decided they didn't want to go, so they joined the Odawa Indians. As the war chief, he was not somebody who was, let's say, warm and fuzzy, and just caused a lot of problems for the chief's Waukazoo. He convinced Judge Kellogg that the 1 acre that the Native Americans had there wasn't enough. They needed more. So Judge Kellogg sold them 15 acres. So kind of consider Collins Park up to Heinz Pickle, that area there. The next thing you know, Chief Masabe invites Father Wiskowski to build a Catholic church and establish a cemetery there. Not exactly what Reverend Smith wanted, but he was semi-okay with it. So he actually went to meet Father Wiskowski, and Father Wiskowski just basically blew him off and said, hey, these are Catholics. These are my converts, not yours. Go back to your mission and hang out there. So not much cooperation there. And which is when Reverend Smith started preaching there in 1844. There were lots of problems. If Father Wiskowski was in the area, right in the middle of one of Reverend Smith's church services, he would blow the horn and ring the bells, and it was time for his service. So some of the Native Americans would get up and go over there. So just not a good situation at all. Then on January 1st, 1847, things changed. Reverend Van Raalte and George Harrington and Judge Kellogg arrived at the Old Wing Mission at the Smith House and said, hey, we're looking for a place for some Dutchmen to settle. I've got about 40, 50 people that came on a boat with me and we're looking for a place to live. Well, that was fine with Reverend Smith and the Odawa Indians. They took Reverend Van Raalte around. It was a really bad snow year. Reverend Van Raalte was a little short guy. He had typhoid fever a few months before. He wasn't really all that strong. So they actually pulled him around on a sled. Quite often it was said that they carried him, but they actually had a sled that they were taking him around so that they could show him all the various places that they could settle, showed him how rich soil was here, how much potential it had with all the big trees and everything. Not sure he really saw the swamps and marshes, but that's another thing. So he said, yep, we're moving in here, started buying land. The first work party arrived on February 9th. And what they did is they built the street where Waverly is now, and then built some cabins, which are close to where Denoy or Chevrolet are. There were 2 cabins that were built there early on. And the Dutch just kept on coming and coming. Van Raalte just really didn't know how many people were going to come. But by June, there were 100 people, which is when the Odawa Indians said, I think we're all going to migrate north this summer. And when they came back, there were about 2,000 Dutch folks between Holland and Zealand and Overijssel and yada, 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 yada. A lot of people were there and they just kept on coming. So in the first 5 years of the colony, it's estimated that about 5,000 people came from the Netherlands. So just to point out where we are, here's where the Old Wing Mission House is and the schoolhouse. Here's where the Native Americans had their land. When I'm talking about the landing, that's over here. That's where Heinz Pickle is. This is where Holland was settled. Van Raalte's house, which was where the soccer fields are here at Hope College. The log church, which was in Pilgrim Home Cemetery. The early shanties. Here's what's now Waverly Road. And that's where Denoyer Chevrolet is, right around in that area. The trail going off to Zealand, Graskop. Another wonderful map by Mark Hook that I just love getting lost in, but we'll keep going. Should never give me 2 controls. So when the Dutch were here, initially there was lots and lots of cooperation, lots of assistance offered. However, when the Dutch went north, when the Indians went north for the summer, more and more Dutch arrived. They were seeing all of these shelters, this food, these tools, all this maple sugar making equipment, and just decided we're going to take it. We don't have anything, the Lord is providing to us. And if they got caught, they had to offer compensation to the Indians, but not that much. The unfortunate other thing that happened is that when the folks that settled Zealand came over, one of the 3 ships, there was smallpox on it. And the Indians are incredibly susceptible to smallpox, like with a 90% mortality rate. So when they came back and found out about smallpox, they're like, we're out of here. There was some retaliation. There was some pilfering of food. They actually kidnapped a couple of Dutch women, and Reverend Van Raalte had to rescue them with a blanket. Reverend Van Raalte offered, medical help to some of the Indians, but in general, they just kind of avoided each other because of all the diseases, and the Dutch were very intimidated by the Indians. They had things like guns that the Dutch didn't have. They also had really big, mean dogs, which the Dutch really weren't familiar with. So it was like not a good situation. And the Native Americans decided, we're out of here, but they needed to make some arrangements in 1848 before they could do that. So they had decided to move permanently to the Leelanau Peninsula, north of Traverse City. And Reverend Smith decided to join them. Reverend Smith and Isaac Fairbanks had a falling out regarding the oxen. The Native Americans convinced Reverend Smith that the oxen were not well being taken care of. Good old Mr. Masabi again. And Isaac took it personal. I guess he really loved his oxen. And unfortunately, they had a falling out. So he was no longer involved. And that's when Reverend Smith's wife's cousin's husband took over as the farm agent. The other thing is Masabe decided that he wanted to take over the tribe and tried to kill the chief Waukazoo, which at that time was Peter Waukazoo. Peter survived and immediately removed Masabe from the tribal registers, basically kicked him out of the tribe, said, if you're going to do this to me, you're no longer, part of us. And then Masabe died in 1850. The Native Americans got permission to sell their land they had to get it from the state of Michigan. And as they sold it, they got very, very good prices for it. It was something where Reverend Smith, Reverend Van Raalte, Isaac Fairbanks make sure that the land that was developed, instead of just getting, pittance, they actually got what the land was worth. And as I'd mentioned, James McLaughlin, who is Arvilla Smith's cousin's husband, he was appointed farm agent. He happened to be a shipbuilder and a ship captain. So he built a ship or buys a ship in Chicago, fixes it up. And the Native Americans all left north to go to the Leelanau Peninsula on June 1st, 1849. Reverend Van Raalte, they had a nice ceremony for them, and they were able to sail out of the harbor and ended up in Leelanau Peninsula and established another mission up there. I find this to be interesting. This is from the Joint Archives of Holland, which is the Hope College Western Theological Seminary archives. I once asked somebody at the museum if the Joint Archives of Holland was like the marijuana museum in the Netherlands, but I'm like, no, let me explain this a little better. So, so this was Albertus Van Raalte buying the land that was called the Landing and the Catholic church that was there. He purchased it for $26, bought it from Peter Waukazoo. And what I find interesting about this document is Peter Waukazoo actually was able to sign his own name, unlike the earlier documents with Reverend Smith where there was an X involved. So that was a good price for the land and for the house. This is also another deed that we have in the Holland Museum collection where George Smith they were moving land around so that they could legally sell it because some of the deeds hadn't been properly transferred. Some of them would just use their land for collateral for money and then buy the land back later when they had money. So there was a need to get all of the land contracts in order. And this is one of the deeds that was produced to handle that so that he could sell this one part of the land. This is also cool. This is a map from approximately 1849, which is the first map of the Holland area. This is available online at the Holland Museum in the archives. So if you're into maps, this is one that's really fun to look at. It's kind of hard to see it on this screen, but it's such an early map. It shows all of the different colonies in the area, and I'm into maps, so I just found that one to be really, really cool. So, moving on to the Smith family, there were multiple kids. Let's see, 4 of them lived to adulthood. George Jr., who became a Congregationalist minister. Mary Jane, who, who married, had lots of kids. Arvilla, who also had a large family. Esther Eliza died when she was 3.5 years old and was buried at the Old Wing Mission, along with 3 of her brothers who died pretty much at childbirth. And all of those children, there's also one child who's buried up in the Leelanau Peninsula and one that was buried in Vermont. But the 3 young babies and Esther Eliza were moved to the Pilgrim Home Cemetery in 1867. And the stone that is there was the original stone that was brought over by the Smith family in 1845. When they went on that sabbatical, it was partially because Esther Eliza had died, and it was such a hard blow for her mom. And they came back with a stone, and it's still there. When we give tours of Pilgrim Home Cemetery, you can take a look at it. It's pretty cool. So it's the oldest tomb or the oldest tombstone in Pilgrim Home Cemetery. So when we're talking about the Smith Waukazoo family, George died in 1880. Arvilla lived another 17 years and died in 1897. Their son, George Jr., was a Congregationalist minister, helped his dad for quite a few years, had 9 children. Mary Smith married Payson Waukazoo. And if you probably don't remember, but Chief Joseph Sr. had 3 kids. His oldest daughter was Choni. She had a son who was Payson, so lived right next door to the Waukazoos. He attended the school, and he and Mary decided to get married. George Smith was absolutely fine with it. Not quite as good, but it was something where it was a very successful marriage. And it was also interesting because they became the family historians. A lot of the documents that are associated with the Old Wing Mission are actually up by them. They were the ones who donated the George Smith diaries to the Library of Congress, and Arvilla Smith's diaries to the University of Michigan, to the archives there. So they've been a great source of information regarding, the family. The other daughter, Arvilla Aurelia, had 11 children. And then Esther Ann, who was the youngest daughter, she was married twice, but never had any children. So the Old Wing Mission building, the house that we were talking about, was purchased by Isaac Fairbanks in 1854. It remained in his family on and off for over 100 years. They sold it at times. It would come back. They built 2 additions to it. This is going to be really hard to see, but right here is the floor plan. The building is 24 feet by 30 feet. There's a bedroom here on the first floor. There's a parlor, and there's a kitchen in the back. And there were 3 bedrooms upstairs, so it's a 1.5-story house. So the bedrooms are small and pretty low to the ceiling, but people were a lot shorter there. They weren't 6'4" like I am, so that I'm sure helped. There was an addition built in 1886. And that's shown here in black. There was like another living room, another kitchen, and also a bedroom. And then in 1903, there was another addition on this side, including a toilet. And then that was is still attached to the house. Charles Lawrence bought it in the 1860s. He's a historian from Saugatuck who really is the person who pulled together a lot of the early information on the Old Wing Mission. He had close ties with the family up north. He operated as a bed and breakfast for a while. He opened it for tours and school groups, and the person who owned it for a while after him did the same thing. But it really was a private residence still till 2023. Well loved, well taken care of, but things change, and that's coming up. So this is another picture of the Old Wing Mission. And then we have the sign. It's a Michigan Historic Site. So the sign is still out front. If you drive by it, it makes it a lot easier to find. And it's on both the Michigan and the National Register of Historic Places. I think it's the 2nd oldest building in Allegan County, which makes it one of the oldest buildings in Western Michigan. It is the oldest building in the city of Holland. It was actually annexed by the city of Holland in 2022. Outstanding historic value. So like I'd said, I gave that talk about the Old Wing Mission at the Holland Museum in July. At that time, I was hearing inklings that there were things going on. LG had the original plant where they paid $1 billion for. They were building an addition to it that was costing another $1.7 billion. And there were rumors that they were buying the houses along 40th Street, in which there's 4 or 5 of them. And heard rumors that the Old Wing Mission was for sale, but just never really got any confirmation about it. And then suddenly there was an article in the Sentinel on October 3rd saying, there's this partnership with Toyota where they're going to have a $3 billion expansion. And these are going to be the electric batteries that we're going to make cars, or maybe the electric batteries for Toyota finally introducing electric cars. It's like, I think I know what's going on. They're probably going to tear all these buildings down and build that factory there. I was hearing more and more rumors that things were not good. So I decided to write a letter to the editor for the Sentinel, which appeared on Thanksgiving Day, basically saying, hey, we need to keep an eye on what was going on. And I was talking to people in the Sentinel, and they were like, until we have some actual proof, we just can't really start running articles. But yeah, we're keeping an eye on it, and just hopefully everything will work out fine. So that was end of November. Then Austin Mertz, who's the reporter who covers the city of Holland, found out that the property records were finally recorded in the deeds in the clerk's office in Allegan County. All those houses had been bought, and it was like, what's going to happen to these? Are they going to keep them? Does LG understand what they have here? We just really weren't sure. He wasn't sure, they weren't answering any questions to him. And we were just getting pretty concerned that things were not going to turn out well. This happened midweek. On a Thursday, I started contacting every historian I knew in the area, saying, hey guys, we need to mobilize and come together and figure out what we can do about this. There was a city meeting, council meeting the next, I think it was Monday. And we decided we would go to that and talk in the comment section at the beginning, where everybody's able to give a 5-minute talk about what they're concerned about. So there were about 10 of us that showed up, and about half a dozen of us, gave talks saying, hey guys, you've got something that's really important here. And LG was asking for an exemption for an expansion of their first plant. And they needed some tax breaks for that. So we were saying, hey, this should all start getting related. And it was like, they were listening to us. Yeah. And when it was time for LG to have their presentations on why they wanted the tax breaks and what it was all about, Mayor Bosch stands up, and I'm so proud of him. He just basically said, okay, guys, I know that, you're not really from town, but this is something historically that is incredibly important to this community. And understand that for everybody who's talked today, there's 100 people that would be just as glad to talk about this and say, this is important. And you just really have to pay attention to this and make sure that this building is preserved. And they were like, okay, but they got it. And since then, they decided to form a task force to figure out what to do with the building. And I've been raising my hand saying I will gladly be on this task force, and more than likely, I'm hoping I will be. But it's just, the options are, do you keep it there? Which would be absolutely wonderful from a historic perspective. You really want to keep buildings where they originally were. However, if it's 50 feet from a 5-story factory, is that really context? And with Van Raalte Farms being so close, which is exactly the same environment that Old Wing Mission was. In fact, that's why Van Raalte, Albertus Van Raalte, bought that for his sons for a farm, because it was some of the best farmland in the area. And it was very similar to what was at the Old Wing Mission area, same maple trees, same everything. So it just made sense to do this. And they have agreed that, yes, I finished this a week ago, and since then the story has continued. There was an open house last week, and they said, yep, we're going to save it. They're talking more and more about preserving it on site and trying to figure out ways to build their factory so that it will not interfere with the footprint of the Old Wing Mission too badly. But we'll just have to wait and see. So the building really appears to be safe. I'm not concerned about it, unless some absolute terrible disaster happens. It should be able to go forward. What we're also pushing for is on-site archaeology, something like ground penetrating radar, which is absolutely a wonderful tool. It's relatively inexpensive. We don't know if there are bodies there. And we also know that there's various buildings there. Where exactly were there, and ground penetrating radar would be a wonderful way to figure out what this is. They understand that and they're considering it. They said, yep, this is a good idea, something we need to consider. So that was absolutely wonderful to hear that from them. The other big question is, do we keep it on the existing site, or do we move it somewhere like Van Raalte Farms, close to the Ben Van Raalte house there? The city of Holland has always looked for other uses for that property. And this is something where it would fit in really well with the historical aspect of the park. Also, the city of Holland really wants to build some sort of an education center there. And I'm like, why don't you build one that at least one of the rooms is 24 by 30, just like the old schoolhouse was, and use that to teach school. And we'll see what happens. I'm interested, and also LG has expressed interest in restoring the interior to what it looked like in the 1840s. Those of you who have been to the Settler's House associated with the Holland Museum, I could imagine it being something like that. But really the main thing is just making sure it's viable long-term, it's accessible. It has absolutely wonderful historic and educational value. And I just hope that we can keep it going and use it for those purposes. The city of Holland is incredibly cooperative. They are 100% on board. I don't know how many of you know Anna Minabo, who handles a lot of the historic aspects for Holland. She's absolutely excellent. She is on top of this. When I asked her, she said that because of all the projects going on, someone in the office that she works in, probably someone's talking to LG pretty much every day. And they don't have any bad vibes that anything bad's going to happen. It's just a matter of playing it out, and just being vigilant and making sure that things work the way that we really want them to work. So that's my last slide. So thank you very much for not falling asleep. And I'll take questions at this time.
As a young girl, I remember walking through Van Raalte's home, and I'm so sad that it was not saved. And I wondered if you have any information on the history of why that was not saved.
Oh, that's a PhD thesis.
That's what?
It's a PhD thesis. Incredibly complicated. What happened was that Erdmans, who owns Erdmans Publishing Company, bought it from the Van Raalte family. And it was supposed to be a Dutch history center. Erdmans had also bought the Van Raalte papers that had first been bought by somebody else, and he had his hands on both of them. So he was going to donate those to become this history center. And then what happened was the person who they had picked, who lived in the Netherlands, actually died of a heart attack. And suddenly he couldn't, he was not available. And they just couldn't find anybody else to be the person who was going to run this. Hope College owned it. It's in Holland Township instead of Holland City. And Holland Township was like, we really don't care about this building. If you call about trespassers or something, we'll get at it to maybe in a couple of days. So it was just getting more and more run down. And finally, and also Erwin Lubbers, who was the president of Hope at the time, really wanted more athletic fields. And this was the perfect place for them. So finally, they just tore it down. And, that was the end of that. What Elton Bruins was able to rescue a few things. We have a few bricks and like a windowsill. But I mean, it's something where it was just done so absolutely poorly. And Mr. Erdmans was so mad because he had donated this building for this, that instead of donating the Van Raalte papers to Hope College or the city of Holland, which had been his intent, he donated them to Kelvin College, sort of like, yeah. And on top of that, he had them sign papers that they would not make them available to Elton Bruins, who was the leading Van Raalte scholar for like 10 years. Finally, Elton got a copy of like a Xerox copy of them, that are now in the the Van Raalte Institute or the Joint Archives. But I mean, it was just a horror story. So the good news now is that Calvin received some grants, so they are in the process of putting them all available online. So I actually looked at some of them as I was preparing this talk because, once again, I really get geeked out about this stuff. And so that was just fun to look at. So.
Sir, it's obvious that you are geeked about this.
Yeah,
And what is it in you that makes you so passionate about this?
I think a certain amount of it is my Dutch heritage, and I've always been somebody who's been interested in history. Like I said, I'm a chemist, and I'm a bit of an out-of-the-box thinker. So I'm always somebody who likes artwork. I like history, things that make me think about things that are not necessarily what would be, traditional science or things like that. So it's just something that for some reason I've just always liked history. I've always liked art. I can't draw worth a darn. I love music. I can't play or sing a note, but it's just kind of the way I am.
In northern Michigan, there's a great deal of discussion and controversy over Indian schools.
Yes.
To what extent do we experience some of that here in this area as well, as they migrated from one location to the other?
Most of that was later. The Old Wing Mission, to be perfectly honest with you, there were a few Native Americans that learned how to read and write there, but they usually attended for just a few months a year. Actually, I think the Smith family and Payson were the folks that really were more educated than anybody else there.
I have a question. When I think about farming in woodland, I think about having to clear the woodland.
Mhm.
And it sounds like they didn't, that they used it for the maple syrup.
They did both. By the time the Dutch arrived, about 200 acres of land was cleared. Now, I don't know how much of this was, open before, but that was the more valuable land that the Dutch bought for like $3 an acre. And some of that was farmed, and some of it was used for pastures for the horses and cows and, whatever other animals that they had. So.
Yeah, this is marginally relevant, but I'll ask it anyway. I was taken by the deed with Peter Waukazoo's signature on it.
Yes.
Has that ever been grapho analyzed? And the reason I ask that is the writing seems remarkably similar, or the signature seems remarkably similar to Benralty's.
Let me show you
And
something.
Please do.
I was thinking the same thing. However, when I looked at it, we have a P here. We have a P here. We have a W here. We have a W here. So they're different enough. And also, if you look at the signature really closely, it's, Van Ralty's, handwriting was very smooth. And this is a lot rougher. So I'm convinced it's Peter Waukazoo's signature. Somebody could convince me elsewise who knows more than I know, but, Yes.
You mentioned that in the landing, at the landing,
Mhm.
there was a church and a cemetery.
Yes.
Prior to it becoming Collin Park and Heinz
Yep.
Pickle Factory. When those were created or built, was there any recognition of the fact that they were being built on cemetery land?
What happened was that the Native Americans, when they moved north, took all of their dead. And what had happened is most of the deaths had occurred the year before there had been a cholera outbreak. So there were about 150 Indians in the Holland area at that time, and I believe 16 of them died. And there were actually 19 burials at the cemetery, where basically where Heinz Pickle is. And supposedly, theoretically, they moved them all. So the cemetery was gone. However, what's also interesting is that if you look at the history of Heinz Pickle, especially early on, occasionally they would find a body. And I've always wondered if there were bodies that were not moved, or even more likely, in the first 5 years of the colony here, the Dutch lost 500 people. 10% of their people died. And I've often wondered, since there was a church there, that some of these people were buried at the church and then just never moved. So I don't know. Do you want your liquid tide question answered? Yeah. All right. You probably noticed there was a box, there's a liquid tide bottle and also a box of Tide with bleach. When I joined Monsanto, they were the largest producer of laundry detergent ingredients in the world. And phosphates had just been taken out of laundry detergents, and the quality of laundry detergents was pretty poor. So Procter & Gamble decided to break away from the traditional types of formulations and look for new things. And two of the products that made it were Tide with bleach and liquid Tide. So my first projects at Monsanto were to develop processes for making what's the bleach in Tide with bleach and a secret ingredient for liquid Tide. So I spent 9 years doing this, probably 100 trips down to Texas, and that was enough. We lost the Tide with bleach contract, and then they reformulated liquid Tide and no longer needed our secret ingredient. So I've got the last little sample of it on my but I think at one time those were original boxes and bottle from the original pilot plant production of the first runs of those products. The thing is that I'm not sure if they still are, because especially the plastic bottles, it seems like the initial one that I had actually started falling apart and I just slipped another one up there. So, I mean, I got to do some absolutely wonderful things. Yeah, I did that for the first 9 years of my career, and then literally traveled the world. And I was like the technical expert who would go around and give talks like this to people, explaining to them why you wanted to buy our stuff instead of our competitors, explain to them how to use more of it, how to formulate things properly. A lot of it was safety related. Some of the products that I dealt with, I like to say they burned, stank, and exploded. So it's just making, literally it was, keeping companies safe. And it was just an absolutely wonderful job, but I just finally got burned out. And I literally was in Paris on an absolutely beautiful October afternoon. And I said, I would rather be home. And that's when I knew it was over. So, yes.
We have one question from online. They were wondering if you would be willing to show the plaque at the cemetery again. And if you could describe where Pilgrim Home Cemetery actually is.
Sure. So here's the plaque. Those of you who are familiar with the cemetery, if you start off and that's on 16th Street, close to 16th and Fairbanks. Hope College has their tennis courts, the indoor ones, it's just to the south of there. The plaque is very, very close to what's called the Pioneer section, which is where there's very, very few tombstones. And that's where the initial people were buried. After Van Raalte in 1852 said, "Thou shalt not bury Dutchmen wherever you want, and you have to bury them in the cemetery. It's $1 to bury an adult and 50 cents to bury a kid." They started using that section, and the next open grave is where the next person would be buried. By 1840 or 1867, they had areas that you could buy for a family plot, and this is in that area there. But if you're in the area that's not developed, you can see the back of the sign very easily.
Great talk. Thank you.
You're welcome.
When Park Township had a centennial, I don't know what year that was, but pre-COVID, I know that there was some descendants of Waukazoo, Chief Waukazoo, that came down, and I'm curious, I went with my husband, if you were there and what your thoughts on that were.
I was not there. I know that they are active. Supposedly there's some absolutely wonderful museum stuff up there. I'm not sure if there's still a museum up there, but Bob Zwieringa was telling me about this. Oh, you need to go up there sometime and explore what's up there. And I will sooner or later. This is talks that are going to continue. The next version of this will be in 2 months on April 16th, the day after tax day, for the Zeeland Historical Society. It's supposed to be part of their, they have a series of talks at New Groningen School. I'm not sure that we're going to fit in New Groningen School. It might have to get moved, and they'll probably have to buy some extra cookies because I'm guessing that it's going to be a pretty good crowd. But yeah, so I got that one scheduled. There's a couple of other ones that are, that are kind of rambling around that people are interested. So we'll see how it goes. The next one, I have permission from LG to go take some pictures around the building, which is what I want to do for the first one. Get rid of some of the stuff on my books and things like that. I mean, it's kind of cool, but and then also, they also said that they would try to get me inside of the house. So I would love to have that for that talk also. So the story is going to continue, and I hope that some of you will show up and hear that one too. So I'm always, I'm a HASP member. If you see me, have questions, want to know what's going on, feel free to ask me at any time. So
If you want to borrow some of his books, where.
just remember, it costs you ice cream if you return them to me too late. It's also something where I'm very involved with Ottawa County Parks. I'm in charge of the hiking group for HASP. In fact, I'll probably be taking a hike at this afternoon. So, and then also I'm involved with Project Clarity. My work at Monsanto, a lot of it involved phosphates. So since Project Clarity is about taking phosphates out of the environment, it's kind of like penance for all of the billions of pounds that were introduced into the environment because of, the absolutely wonderful work that I did of convincing customers to buy more and more of our stuff. So on that note, thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah.